when we speak to post-capitalism, the first thing is it must be informed by capitalism itself. So we need to understand historical systems. We need to understand like these nested hierarchies that we've been embedded in. And it's well beyond the market and the exchange of monies. It is an understanding that capitalism mediates every part of our everyday life. From what food do we eat, to where do we live, to who are our friends, to whether or not we have access to this computer and a stable Wi-Fi connection and the ability to know one another. Every experience is mediated by capital.
Post-capitalism is not just like, it's not a temporal thing, right? It's not the thing that comes after capitalism. It's ways of living, being, and relating to the world that are based on values such as generosity, altruism, compassion, interbeing, animism, relationality, solidarity with all life, etc. And we can create these cultures. And that's part of our kind of generational task, to create these embodied cultures. And we can do that with free people. You know, embodied cultures can be created with very small groups of people, and that ripples out.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with me, Dan Burgess. The story of Spaceship Earth is simple. We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. Like a spaceship, we have a finite amount of supplies with an intelligent operating system called nature, which keeps everything replenished as long as we all respect it and participate wisely. In this podcast, I'm in conversation with folk involved in regenerating life, shifting consciousness and reimagining how we can live more beautifully and peacefully. I talk with artists, writers, activists, designers, adventurers, healers, farmers, creative mavericks, and more. Their stories invite us to participate in the co-creation of life-sustaining cultures, in service to life, becoming crew on Spaceship Earth. Greetings, Earthling. This is Dan, your host. Welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast. This is a podcast where we have conversations rooted in these unravelling times, unlearning together, and we explore and reflect on ideas, ways of being, thinking, knowing, and relating to this earth and to each other that put life at the centre again. So welcome back. If you're a regular listener, we really appreciate you being here. And if you're new, welcome aboard. We hope you enjoy your time here with us. How are you showing up today? I woke up this morning after scrolling Instagram, which is something I'm really trying to stop doing. I was left with this kind of impression that I'm actually living in a version of Star Wars, the film I loved as a kid in the 1970s. It seems that in our dominant culture, it's becoming a choice between the Empire or the Rebel Alliance. Now, I know that's playing to the binary and divisive, which I'm really trying to resist. But for me, choosing to commit to the practice of love, compassion, solidarity and connection with all life and all beings is the only way right now. Peace is the way. So I want to give some quick news on some new events before we get into this episode, which is a biggie. I'm doing this up front because I think most people drop off at the end of the podcast conversation. And so, actually on that, I'm going to be playing out with a really beautiful song as well. So please stay on for this episode. But I want to let you know about a series of live online events that we are offering through Becoming Crew over the next 3 months. They're open to everyone. They're like 2-hour events. There's a whole range of ticket prices. We're trying to make these things as accessible as possible. They are not just kind of content drops, they're going to be experiential and participative. Our aim here is to give a flavour of how we're practicing as a community, and they feature some amazing guest teachers. So why should you come? Well, we are sensing that there is so much stuckness right now in our culture, so much fear, so much divisiveness in these times. And it feels that many of us keep looking to these dominant systems and structures and ways of doing things and ways of thinking to try and solve things, to try and solve all of these crises. But what if these ways are actually limiting our abilities to create the changes we long for? And how can we create space to explore new ways of thinking about the contexts we find ourselves in, different ways of perceiving the world and our place within it, and more ways to understand our stuckness, and then to practice new moves that can nurture new cultures of connection and care, solidarity and community, creating spaces for more people who know in their hearts we need new ways of showing up, new ways of relating to this context we are all in. So with all of that, we are experimenting by offering initially a series of 3 events, one a month, May, June and July. You can they have been curated as a kind of cycle, but you can also just come to any one of them if you can't do all 3. But they're events for unlearning together. They'll include guest provocations, participative experiences, embodiment practices, and then creative reflective practices to work with the content that you receive in the session. And also, if you participate in one of these events, you'll also get access to our ongoing community of practice who meets online across the wheel of the year. So if you're interested, the links to all of that are in the show notes, and more information and tickets. So yeah, we'd love to see you there. And let's come and try it out. Try one, buy one. I was going to say buy one, get 2 free, but we can't do that because we're already running on fumes. But try one. If you're curious, just this is an opportunity to come and experience something a little bit different and see what might happen. And bring a friend. So, on to this episode. So, this is the 6th year of this podcast. This is episode 84, but technically it's actually over 100. Because like my neurodivergent mind, the podcast has ebbed and flowed in format from longer form, deeper sort of emergent conversations to more structured, to lots of experimental episodes and music and stuff. So it's actually over 100. But anyway, I find at least something very interesting and exciting in every episode and conversation I've released. They continue to challenge my assumptions and beliefs, these conversations, which is why I keep doing them. But every so often, as a podcast creator, you record a conversation that feels just so vital, so full of intelligence, provocation, insight, that just feels really rich, important, and often uncomfortable. Fertiliser, if you like, for the times that we're in. And there's a kind of rawness and wholeness to an entire conversation that you have that just feels really worth sharing all of it. And this is one of those episodes. This episode is a long one. And actually, when we did consider potentially kind of chopping it up into 2, splitting it into 2, but then it just felt like that just felt part of this old story, really, of making things more digestible and convenient to consume. And if there's anything about these times we're in, they're not easy. So we do, however, offer an intentional reflective pause halfway through this conversation. So you'll hear that, and the invitation is to sit. There's a sort of a meditative pause to sit with the first hour before we move into the second. So who am I in conversation with? Well, I'm in conversation with Alnoor Ladha and Lynn Murphy. Now, they are both long-term activists, political strategists, and in their words, accidental philanthropy advisors. They are, to me, I think, two of the wisest souls I've ever hosted here on this podcast. Their ability to articulate the mess we're in as a species and how we got here while gesturing towards ways through is I think, quite remarkable and a real gift in the offering that they give us here. They also have this incredible humility. They do not see themselves as any kind of gurus. In fact, the total opposite. They see themselves as weavers of ongoing evolutionary intelligence and contextual knowledge. They draw on wisdom and learnings from a vast, diverse web of life, traditions, cultures, professions, and expertise, past and present. And they created this extraordinary book, which is a kind of synthesis of all that. The book is entitled Post-Capitalist Philanthropy, Healing Wealth in the Time of Collapse. It's offered in a really profound way. I would say it's a thing of beauty. So much care and attention has gone into its creation. It's kind of like a handbook, sort of mapping out the history of wealth accumulation through to this logic of late stage capitalism that we're in, and offering towards other ways of knowing, sensing, and being that can cultivate new logics, new life-centric logics for humans to organise around in right relationship with life itself. And the book is also just, it's beautiful art in it. It's got these incredible reflective practices that are offered up after each chapter. It really goes deep. It really helps you as a reader really start to consider and notice so much, I guess, of the systems that we would perceive probably as normal and common sense when it comes to our relation with these kind of systems of power, systems of capital, economics and resource. So yeah, it's pretty profound. I think if I was Minister for Education on Spaceship Earth right now, this book, probably along with Hospicing Modernity, would be kind of like foundational curriculum books for our young people to explore. But hey, I'm not. This conversation is deep. It's really wide-ranging. It sets out a very dynamic perspective on, in their words, the waters we're swimming in right now and the consequences we are experiencing today from the design of the systems, structures, beliefs and ways of perceiving the world that we have inherited from the imaginations and contextual realities of those in power who came before us, going back through a journey of at least 500 years, but probably more to sort of 5,000 years. Now, there's a lot in here that may be challenging to some of you, especially if you've grown up like me as a white person in a Western society and you've experienced the access, freedom, rights, and bought into the promises of the story of progress, infinite economic growth, and all the perks of modernity that we might feel entitled to. But I hope that this episode does bring up a lot, and I hope that it might stimulate more dialogue and exploration at a much deeper level around the kind of contradictions, complexity, and the mess we all find ourselves in, regardless of our identities, background, or political persuasions. Inviting more humility and even opening up more conversation about what post-capitalism might even be without being shot down, as the term itself is already very polarizing, as has been said many times before. How can we more easily imagine the end of the world versus the end of capitalism? That feels profoundly wrong and sad for an idea, a human construct, capitalism, that is just a few hundred years old on a planet that is 4.6 billion years old. Capitalism is a mere cosmic wing flap in the grand scheme of Earth time. So, let's cut to this. This is the Spaceship Earth podcast in conversation with Alnoor Ladha and Lynn Murphy. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with my dad, Dan Burgess.
Okay. Lynn, Alnoor, welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Good to see you. Whereabouts are you, you guys on Spaceship Earth?
We are in the northwest jungle of Costa Rica in a land project called Tierra Valiente, which is an 88-acre commons regenerative agriculture project. And we have a center here. We call it Center for Applied Cultural Transition.
Wow. And how are you showing? Is it morning-ish, or is it sort of midday? Was coming up to midday? Is it or something?
Yeah, it's like 10:45 in the morning over here.
I was very lucky to spend a year in Costa Rica with my very young family at the time in 2010, which was a very transformational year for me, actually. But beautiful country, lot happening. I imagine you could do a whole conversation on community living, but that
Definitely do a whole conversation about what is going on in Costa Rica.
Yeah, the kind of neocolonialist gentrification
under the auspices of regenerative development. But we won't do that today.
No, and I could sense a bit of that when we were there. You know, the sort of particular, the sort of land ownership, particularly, and it did worry me slightly. Actually, thinking where was that gonna go? It seemed to be like a lot of the locals were just selling off all the land, and you could see the youngsters, the young Costa Ricans, and I was thinking, well, how's this going to end up? Like, but anyway, that's a whole nother podcast. So how are you guys showing up? Like, in this moment, Lynn?
Yeah, in this moment, I'm grateful to be here. Alnoor and I are together part of the time, and part of the time I live in the other part of the country, way up in the high mountains. And so it's always a gift when we're in presence on the land and what we're stewarding here today. And I was born into the lineage of Christianity, and I have returned to the Gnostics. And so today is Good Friday. So I'm showing up this morning with my morning practice this morning, I was sitting with like, where is the energy of Judas? Like, where is it that we betray that which is pure, that which is the divine, that which is the sacred, and then the remorse that we have immediately after. And I was rereading, the coinage that came from the high priest to Judas. And I was reflecting on like, where is my ego? Perhaps betraying something that I know is actually sacred. So that's where my morning and daily reflections are today that may color and permeate our conversation.
Thank you. Alnoor.
We're in the historical ancestral lands of the Malaku people, and they're still in this region about 100 kilometers from here, to the northeast near Rio Celeste. But they were historically and ancestrally and even currently sort of masters in communication and mediation. So tribes would come from the north, Aztecs, Mayans, and from the south, Incans, to seek their counsel. And so I'm sitting with, a request permission prayer to the ancestral guardians of this land to allow what comes through be in service to what's happening in this moment in what you would call spaceship Earth, at the edge of consciousness in 2024. And we are also in Ramadan, the holy month of Islam. I grew up in the Sufi tradition. On the 5th next week is Laylatul Qadr, which is the night of power, night of Muhammad's ascension. So even though I renounced Islam at a very young age, It was the one night I always practiced. You just do zikr all night. You do, mantra remembrance throughout the night. So yeah, I'm in preparation for what's coming in the next week or so.
And maybe I'll just add one more piece about the Malaku peoples. Currently, they're the tribe that has the smallest number of people due to the movement and the atrocities of what happened here. And their intention in these days is to continue essentially to make sure that their language stays alive and active. And so they prioritize education, not schooling, but that piece. And so what Alnoor spoke to is this lineage of the art and the science of communication and their knowledge of invocation of what we speak. I felt as he spoke I felt that spirit here with us and honoring the technologies of mind and the lineage that they have held and the ancestors of this land and the current 600 plus members of that nation are holding and tending.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. One of the things I've been trying to start conversations this year on the podcast is just asking my guests, like, what are the vibes on Spaceship Earth right now that you're experiencing, like your own experience of the vibes on the Earth right now? And I wonder whether I could ask you both that as a way to get us into the conversation. Lynn?
Yeah.
There's a cacophony of vibes I'm experiencing or that I'm perceiving and is moving through this vessel. Often I wake up in the morning and I'm with kind of where is my relationship with that which is sacred? Where is the relationship and the vibes? I often wake up feeling anguish for the wars, the starvations, and myriad places of the earth. Many of us know or kind of have an awareness of what's happening within Gaza, within Palestine. This week, Alnoor and I were to have been in Rojava, and a place that also is having, an onslaught of bombs dropped and a silent war. And there are other places that we are connected with in the world, whether it be the Democratic Republic of Congo or Sudan or Yemen or the other places in the world that are very much under assault right now. And so there's a daily anguish and a heartbreak and a heartbreaking open. And simultaneously, some of the vibes that I perceive or feel is more and more of folks leaning into what we might call this edge of the spiritual political praxis beyond just the Western notion of the psychological separate self of let me do my inner work, but really like a longing for impulses that we may speak of that are liberatory in nature and a recognition that it is a collective liberatory impulse. There's really a shedding, even though the movies are doing a lot of like a critique of the white savior, but still embedded within a notion of the white savior. There's others that are, I think, feeling this deeper notion of the inner and collective liberatory impulse. And in that, I think are really in this moment of anguish. And I'll say the lands that we're sitting here in Costa Rica, there's a lot going on here. We already spoke to some of the impulses around land grab and regenerative development. There's also a lot more coming in of various cartels, more and more addiction, the pollution of the waters, the pesticide runoffs. And so I feel the onslaught of the headwinds, and yet I still can feel this quiet, cacophonous and not so quiet impulse to walk with and burn something in a liberatory notion.
Yeah, Lynn has spoken to this bifurcation moment, right? And I probably wouldn't use the word vibes, but more tendencies, the Deleuzian sense, or resonances that are happening. And it feels like this extreme bifurcation, extreme polarization that's happening. Extreme light, extreme dark. And it feels in many ways like the last throes of colonialist capitalist modernity. And what's happening in Palestine being the perfect example, where there's the Iron Dome strategy, right? We're going to import 6 million largely white Jews who are not indigenous to Palestine, and then create these secure borders, right? So-called secure borders, and live on the beach in paradise with this very high quality of life that comes from funding from the military-industrial complex and U.S. aid, and then the zones of exclusion, which are just on the other side of the border, right, where darker skinned people, brown people, black people, indigenous people, women, all the so-called others of Christian capitalism and Judeo-Christian capitalism now, which are millenarian in impulse, right? They are messianic impulses with a 4,000-year morphogenic field of apocalypse and the shadow of that apocalypse. And thinking about Terence McKenna's notion of the eschaton, this kind of event at the end of time, right, at the event horizon. And he would say the eschaton is in parking orbit. We could sort of feel this the catastrophic break moment. And it is also why all the Western powers, including traditionally liberal countries like Canada and the UK, Germany, France, others, New Zealand, Australia, are so in support of the Israeli project, because it represents the zone of exclusion that is the logical outcome of neoliberalism. And so I feel like there's this awakening happening, and simultaneously this doubling down of imperialist, colonialist violence and perpetual war that's required to prop up the existing system.
Yeah, gosh, thank you for that. It's like, I'm feeling my body's sort of fizzing a little bit with everything you're sharing, because I feel that intensity of and for me, overwhelm of kind of like this sort of, I'm looking at the spring, at the equinox here is just really sort of it's really happening now. And there's this, I've got this apple tree in front of me, and it's just starting to blossom, and the birds are kind of doing their thing, and everywhere in the morning and the dawn court. And there's this kind of all of this possibility and joy and beauty. And yet there's all this kind of like knowing that there is so much suffering going on, and violence, and which just seems to be, my sort of felt experience is that it's just getting more intense, more and more intense, almost like someone said the other day, I can't remember what it's called, but it's it's the lash of the tail of the beast that you think is sort of, you think it's coming down, but it's like there's still, and I know that's a great simplification, but I do find that it really, really tough to kind of hold all of that, on a daily basis, or even in the moment, how to be with all of that, both the light and the darkness that we're sort of really witnessing in ways that we've never been able to witness as a species, this sort of, because we can see it and experience it in many ways, and that's never been the case for this species, right? To be able to sort of really understand how we got here and right. And see it. So yes. Wow. So I would like to give listeners just a little bit of, and I know you've spoken on several podcasts, and it's really, I guess, I met, it was seeing you both in Bristol, actually, at the Local Futures, doing that session on your awesome book, which I don't even know if it's called it a book. For me, it feels like a, I don't know. This is a thing of beauty. There's so much in this. You notice all the post-it notes. That's usually a sign for me that I've been captivated. But I saw you both run a session, host a session there, and Anna, I'd been sort of following your work for many years, and your talks and the work of Culture Hack Labs, with real massive appreciation for what you do and how you speak, and how you speak, particularly to what you feel and sense is going on. So I want to say to both of you, actually, just a massive appreciation for this work that you have, that you're bringing out and carrying into the world. And I know there's other multiple strands around it, but I came away thinking I'd love to host a conversation with you about, I guess, what's at the heart of this book, and how we see this playing out in this time. But I wanted to give the listeners just a little sense of, I guess, like how this work has been birthed. Like, what are the kind of seeds and threads and pathways that you both have that has led you to sort of really holding or carrying this in this time? I'm going to let you guys decide who goes first.
Maybe I can continue from your point and then transition to Lynn to talk about the book. And you're pointing to this, right? We're at this moment of not just peak oil, but also peak imperialism, peak white supremacy, peak heteronormativity, peak structural violence, peak anthropocentrism, but also peak possibility.
Right.
Simultaneously, as these old systems break down. And the skill set for the 21st century is one of negative capabilities. To be able to hold simultaneously conflicting ideas in non-dualistic ways. To be able to hold the chaos and the ambiguity and the contradiction and the internal conflicts that we're forced to live within in the neoliberal paradigm. And we use neoliberalism and capitalist modernity or colonial capitalism interchangeably, but we see neoliberalism, this latest chapter, this kind of quickening, this acceleration of late stage capitalism as simply the latest chapter of capitalist modernity. And we like the frame of capitalist modernity. It comes from the work of Abdullah Öcalan, who wrote Manifesto for Democratic Civilization, is in many ways the grandfather, let's say, of the Kurdish resistance and Rojavan revolution in the Middle East, this autonomous zone of Kurdish people between Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And while I like it particularly is that it's not just about capitalism as a political economy. And it's not simply about modernity as a socio-cultural milieu. It's about the convergence of these two things, that growth, debt-based currency, its requirement for infinite perpetual growth, and its connection to this ongoing abstraction and mediation through technology. And so we're now in this state where, people are optimistic about what's coming down the pipeline with AI or with crypto or what have you. And the way we see the system is from a structural, historical, constellational worldview, which is one of accretion from proto-capitalism to the city-state model and hierarchy, patriarchy, violence, to one of colonialist imperialism and white supremacy and Eurocentric Christian supremacy, to the Industrial Revolution and technological supremacy, to this period of the sixth great extinction, the Anthropocene, this strange anthropocentric capital supremacy. And so we're in this kind of wake of this acceleration. And so now we're in the age of consequence. 5,000 years of bad decision-making and war and violence and pillage and rape and genocide has sort of led us to this moment where in our lifetimes, all of these consequences are going to come to bear, right? Debt-based, growth-based currency is a self-terminating algorithm. 3% growth doesn't sound like a lot, but it's the doubling of the global economy every 24 years. So it's the first time economists and ecologists agree there will not be another doubling of the global economy. So in our lifetime, capitalism is going to collapse on its own weight, with huge ramifications globally, right?
And well, you this is the thing, you mentioned this in Bristol. This is the thing that kind of sort of stopped me in my tracks in Bristol in your session. This exact piece about this mechanism, of that growth-based model and what is required in terms of, the extraction, the impacts on our Earth system in order to sustain that growth. And I'm like, I think you said something like, in a decade or two max, we're probably likely to see the devaluation of our major currencies, the collapse of these financial systems, and therefore, I guess, where we got onto the book was all this capital that's currently sitting around. What happens to that? It sort of evaporates, I guess.
Right. Because what is money?
But that's mind-boggling for me. I've kind of sensed that and been working in the climate space for a long time, and I know for sure that the Earth system can't cope with this madness for much longer, but I didn't know this, this agreement between a number now of a sort of economists and ecologists who kind of actually understand now that this model is over. And yet you wouldn't know it
right.
in the culture.
Right. Well, what is money, right? It's essentially an IOU, right? And as soon as the confidence that money will be paid back is removed, the entire system unravels. And it's very simple, right? Your growth has to exceed your interest rate in order for money to be valuable. That's the economics 101, right? The pie has to grow slightly bigger than the debt itself in order for the Ponzi scheme to continue. And at some point that ends, right? We've crossed 6 of the 9 planetary bounds. There's resource limitations, material limitations. Every new technological fix-it we move towards creates cascading effects that we could not have predicted. So electric cars, as the obvious example, where the kind of capitalist apologists and reformists are like, this is the model for transportation. And now we have 12 years or 13 years left of global lithium reserves, right? And what late stage capitalism does is it becomes more and more desperate. So it's deeper and deeper extraction. It's more harmful forms of extraction like fracking. It's so-called development going into the geopolitical south and the so-called emerging economies to extract as much as they can. Where does the growth come from? It comes from either the exploitation of human labor or the exploitation of so-called natural resources, the living world itself. Those are the only 2 places it can come from. And so we're in this treadmill game, and we're all forced to work bullshit jobs, take on mortgages, continue the kind of heteronormative child rearing strategy of more and more human beings. And that has all sorts of consequences that come with it. And then there's all these alibi strategies to get out of it, right? The technological fixes, the geoengineering of the climate, and philanthropy. And we see philanthropy as not only an externality of capitalism, this so-called unintended side effect, but also it's an extension of capitalism. And so we don't have to focus a lot on philanthropy today. And I think I'll give it to Lynn to talk a bit about the book, but it's just a kind of prime symptom. And it gives us a lens into how broken the system is and how desperate power elites are to tell us that they have the solution. We think of it as like the siren and the lullaby, right? They tell us, look, there's all these major problems, massive inequality, highest levels of inequality we've had since the Roman Empire, right? When a handful of families ran the city-state. Every dollar of wealth is heating up the planet. We're in this, deep ecological collapse. And don't worry, we have it handled, right? The UN and the World Bank and the IMF, we're just going to do more green growth, more green capitalism, more philanthropy. And somehow we're going to get out of this meta crisis, the structural, cascading, existential set of crises. And it's a ridiculous proposition.
Gosh, thank you, Alnoor. There's a lot there, just Lynn, I'd love to. There's something you wrote I think it was in the foreword of your book, which I would love. I think would tee up for you to speak a bit about. And we, as I say, we won't focus long on the philanthropy, but I think it's useful to understand where this came from. But there's something in your intro that says, "May this text serve the healing of all beings, including the fallen deity of money and its offspring, shadow and alibi, philanthropy. May the colonized mind and body be liberated, including our own." And I over to you, Lynn. But that, for me, that, it's a beautiful way of setting up really what this work is about.
Where Alnoor took us was really understanding the waters we swim in, the historical conditions that have brought us to this moment, knowing or a notion that we as a species, as a culture, I'll speak primarily to those who incarnated in what I would call the Occidental mind in geopolitical North or the West, is he was kind of explaining and pointing out what brings us to this moment where we often have amnesia and we're very present phobic, and or we're not very honest about the power, the privilege, the control, the institutional straitjackets, the cultural mimetic structures that keep us, like what I often will call the checkmate of where we are with the neoliberalism or late stage capitalism. And so to that quote, and to kind of what was the provocation for this book, we both named our lineages. Like, what happens when you have a heretical, like, Muslim from a Sufi tradition, a heretical Christian who kind of followed Jesus out of the church and then went and kind of lost her way, but knew that there was something deeply sacred. And yet that was never allowed within the hallowed halls of whether it was philanthropy or the international development system, but bearing witness to the missionary project that had a deep imprint of the savior complex and the proselytization. And then what I saw through, whether it was academia or the UN or the philanthropy, had a different project proselytization called modernity and GDP growth as the only way to alleviate poverty, without an honest reckoning of where we are and where we've been that has led us to this moment, without a contextual understanding of where we are in this moment of the meta crisis, while endowments continue to grow and while the investment in extraction and domination continues on one side, and on the other is a tiny little trickle out in the form of grants, with all sorts of weird cultural dynamics about that. And what we all know, there's a lot of conversation these days about decolonizing reparations, and yet there's still, conscious or unconscious, in the individual, in the collective, in the institution, a lot of power and control. So we sat with, do we have something to say, something to offer, to going upstream to philanthropy, where a lot of the waters are held behind a dam, I would say, both through the endowment and the grant-making mechanism that is essentially setting the agenda for civil society, that is in some ways funding and then kind of co-opting many social movements, that is determining how we perceive the priorities in the world right now. And we wanted to bring something forward of just some honest reckoning and recognizing that part of that prayer that you read is that we are complicit, we are linked, and it is an ever ongoing deconditioning, decolonizing, liberatory impulse. And that we can offer a perspective and what Alnoor laid out, really understand the historical processes that have led us to this moment, and then bring forward, how do we be, as Alnoor, and I think we say in the book, will often say, how do we develop more contextual sensitivity in this moment where we are, so we can be more contextually relevant, or I might say responsive rather than reactive to how we're meeting this moment. And maybe that's enough for now for what gave rise to why we wrote and are offering this as a provocation.
We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. How bonkers is that? You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
If you'd like to support the running of the Spaceship Earth podcast, head over to our Substack and sign up. You'll get every episode straight to your inbox, weekly writing, plus other crew offerings. We're grateful for whatever you can give. Join us at becomingcrew.substack.com. Thank you, Lynn. There's something that's sort of coming up about, which is, inherent in the book. This, for me anyway, one of my big takeouts and something that I'm, practicing and working and exploring, massively in my own life and work is this sense of kind of exploring how to know the world differently to how I was programmed by the culture. And how do I tune into my body? How do I tune into this life that's happening around me, within me, to my fellow humans and more than humans? So I've been, exploring ancestry. I mean, all of this, that there is a lot more going on. And it's, for me in the book, what I loved about, and I mean love as in just because it's just crystallizing the sort of the vitalness of this level of exploration, that if we're stuck in our heads in this moment, how we're just perpetuating, but also we're not drawing on like so much possibility that's also there. Some of it obviously very uncomfortable, but also that idea of the need to work with the uncomfortable to sort of move through to something else. But I'm curious, so I'd love to talk a bit about the somatics, the embodiment of the call for this. Because I would say a lot of it, people say, oh, it's all on the sort of on the fringes. But I think of the work you're doing in the book, and I'm like, my head just goes to like, can I imagine people in institutional power sort of stepping into this stuff and working with this? And I'm curious about how you both recognized the brokenness of the world that you were being offered. Like, was that a very embodied journey for you growing up? Because for me, I know that my kind of, the body was how I totally felt my uncomfort with the culture that I was being programmed into, but I could never explain it as a kid, and I didn't know how to, but I felt it. I felt this kind of real sort of, the constructed reality was really quite terrifying for me as a kid. But so I'm curious, like how your own experience of the world has informed this work. And then I'd love to talk about, this element, this really big piece, which for me feels like the thing, like the elephant in the room almost, of like, unless you can really begin to step in and feel all of this, then I worry that we're sort of stuck.
Yeah, I can start with just a little bit of a reflection on this. When I stepped out of the foundation and I resigned, and I kind of resigned not at the moment that things weren't going well. It actually was when we were having undue influence on the global development agenda, the global education agenda. There was, hundreds of millions of children who learned to read and write who wouldn't have otherwise, absent all the work that was done collectively. And there was a couple of things for me that were going on simultaneously that get exactly to this question you're asking. I was often in classrooms in, different places across sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, different places. And I would go into a first grade or a second grade classroom, and there would be 100 to 200 children sitting in a small room with no ventilation, with on the dirt floor, beyond what we can even imagine, like the heaviness of it. And it was just such, again and again, it wasn't new for me. It was just the constant seeing the continuation of the project of schooling, which links us into modernity. as the colonization of mind and body being an important piece of that, literally like shoved together, sitting cramped up and teaching passivity every single day for those who had the privilege to continue on to finish primary school, to take the exam, to get into secondary school, this continuation of colonization of mind and body and teaching passivity. And so this was happening really deeply on the one hand of what I was perceiving and bearing witness to. And the moment that those children or others would walk out of the classroom, it was almost like they became human again and whole. The other piece of this was I, at the time, was living in the Bay Area, and I had the honor to be around a lot of some of the leading edge body-mind practitioners and theoreticians around the importance of the soma and the mind-body connection. And this is the early days before we were talking a lot about resiliency and trauma. And there was something in me that came through a ceremony that I did that just told me that I had to leave the foundation, that I had to go and study somatics. And so it was kind of this, that the farewell party they gave me at the foundation, it was, okay, first she studied social movements, which is what I did my graduate work on, and the limitations of NGO advocacy. Then she tried to seed a social movement. Now she's actually going to study human movement. And it at the time, it sounded a little bit disjointed, but it was actually this hunch that I had that in the age of enlightenment, so-called, it was actually the age of hyper disassociation and disembodiment. And the way we had to come through was actually connecting to the body, to the way of movement, that this is not separate. The body is not separate from nature. We know this somehow. We don't really live it all the time. And how that this is a really key piece. And what you're speaking of the feeling, I just want to say it's not to get lost in what I see a lot of, if I could say it, Western consternation. Sometimes I call it mindsturbation. Circles where we're talking endlessly about our emotions and our truth. And it's another way that I see ego takes false refuge and weaponizes what we're feeling, rather than actually there's a lot that's being perceived here, that's being moved, that has been thwarted. And perhaps I would, when I say thwarted, in the book, we go into some reflections on what is life force itself, and that the Western culture has kind of disconnected us from the continuum of life and death and life force. And what I see a lot of the project of soma or somatics is trying to move us through either this stuckness or the amygdala hijack that's moving us to fight, flight, or freeze, while purporting to be in the neocortex, while purporting that we know something, when actually we're responding from that reptilian brain. And it's not until we actually come back into homeostasis. And I don't mean that we're in a Zen state. It means we can actually ride levels of discomfort and dissonance, what Alnoor was speaking, the contradictions, with increased resiliency and capability, that we can actually start to come back into right relationship with life force and not be so frozen or stuck, or like this evolutionary eddy that is overly worded and overly fixated on what I feel, rather than actually like living and moving in coherence and congruence with life. That's what I would offer, and see what Alnoor has to add.
Well, maybe I'll say three things: one on the soma, one on ancestry, and one on death. There's a heretical line in Islam that comes from Rabia al-Basra from Iraq in the 8th century. And she was a Sufi saint and prophet. And she says, the body is the prophet, the ummah is the prophet, the desert is the prophet. So the body is the prophet. Of course, this is heretical in institutional Islam because there's one final prophet. And the notion that the body is the prophet is the notion that we are in this active dialogue with this living being that we are stewarding. And it is not only a fractal aspect of the guy in whole. It is where we take our marching orders. It is constantly feeding back to us the quality of our thoughts. And it's not absent of the ummah, of the community, right? So our the way our bodies show up in communal spaces gets reflected back to us through the community, right? Through our interactions, through our dialogues, through our level of solidarity with other beings, human and otherwise. And then the desert is the prophet, is to say the ecology is the prophet, that there is no separate human, there is no separate community of beings in absence of an ecology that holds that. And the quality of the water, of the food, the air is a reflection back to us on who we truly are. And if we take that seriously, of course, what the broader ecology is telling us is an indictment on the Western culture, and the monoculture of globalization. And so, for me, that has to inform the work that we're doing, and then this nested approach of seeing us as embedded congresses of beings as opposed to atomized individuals is part of the ontological shifts that are required. And by ontology, I'm simply referring to the manner by which we approach our belief in the isnness of the world. And the ontology of the dominant culture is one of separation, materialism, and rationalism. In the book, we call this the unholy trinity. So we believe that human beings are anthropocentrically special. We are on top of the evolutionary ladder, as opposed to, let's say, the youngest species in evolution. The materialism is that we have the ability to reduce the entire world to its constitutive parts. The whole world is reduced to the atom, the proton, neutron, electron. And now with quantum physics, we can reduce it to the quanta or the photon or the quasar or what have you. And then the rationalism is not only can we reduce the world to its material constituents, but we are entitled to do so. That the neocortex has the ability to understand the complexity of the mystery of the living cosmos. And this hubris and this arrogance is baked into our ontology. And so part of what we try to move to is what we would call new, ancient, emerging ontologies, where, let's say, separation has an antidote logic of interbeing and interbecoming. We are who we are through others, right? The Ubuntu logic. And that's not to say we are trying to amputate separation. Of course, non-dualistically, I've incarnated in this particular body with my epigenetic, genetic, cultural heritage, and there is temporarily an Alnoor. But we've created a culture where we reify the small s self and denigrate the larger self that is connected into the whole. At every touch point, right? Our passports, our IDs, what we do for a living, the fact that we would even say, I am a lawyer, instead of I practice, made up jurisprudence, man-made law, right? So we're so identified that we have to balance the logic of separation with something like interbeing or interbecomingness or co-liberation. Then the antidote logic to materialism is animism, understanding that the world is alive. Like even Earth system science has caught up with this, the Gaia theory and all of that. So how could there be non-living parts of a living whole? It's fallacious logic, and it makes no sense even within the confines of scientific rationalism and materialism and axiomatic logic. And then the antidote to rationalism is relationality or relationalism. There's a line from David Abram in The Spell of the Sensuous, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, there is no objective truth with a capital T. There's only the quality of relations. There's multiple simultaneous subjective realities, and we can deepen our understanding of those realities through dialogue, discourse, permission, consent, etc. And so now we're not suggesting that there's going to be a simple turn of the key from the unholy trinity to more quantum, queer, indigenous, animistic worldviews, but it requires practice. And so part of our work is to deepen our spiritual political praxis of being in dialogue with the living world and the living cosmos. And I would say an avenue into that is ancestry. That, for example, in the ancient Egyptian tradition or in Sufism and various aspects of Islam and other mystical traditions, I know this is true for many indigenous traditions, the Lakota, the Hopi, the Shipibo in Peru, that we've chosen this particular incarnation. That we chose our parents, our lineage, where we were born, etc. Now, whether you believe that conceit or not, what I'm pointing to is that there is karmic spiritual implications to incarnation in a certain lineage. And these are omens. So if we've incarnated in a white body or a brown body or a black body or a trans body or a heteronormative body, what have you, that these are omens into what our ancestral redemption work is. And, for example, my ancestors, and it's true for all of our ancestors, did not grow up in a world that was self-aware of anthropocentric destruction. Did not grow up in the 6th great extinction, did not grow up in the Anthropocene in this way. And we are at the edge of consciousness. And so there's a different obligation. Even my parents as individuals do not know my entire lineage. My mom spiritually is connected to her line. My dad is spiritually connected to his line. They do not hold what I'm holding. And they're not in the same context as me. And so part of our work is to do ancestral redemption work, but also break aspects of our tradition and our beliefs. I honor the practices of Sufism and Islam that my ancestors practiced because that's what they needed to do, right? They were products of their context. And I honor what that particular religiosity and those institutions did for them, but I do not adhere to those institutions. Right? My fidelity is not to some made up institution. It's to life itself. And that's a very different approach. So I do zikr and I do some of the spiritual practices of Sufism, but I don't identify as a Sufi. I say I come from a Sufi lineage and I practice Sufism, but I'm not going to let any made up religiosity identify my full identity in that way. And even the notion of blood is part of the scientific materialist fiction, right? There's no such thing as Islamic blood or Christian blood or Jewish blood. Just like there's no such thing as capitalist blood or socialist blood or communist blood, right? Evolution is a very long process. The 4.4 billion year process of the Earth is embedded in the 13.8 billion year process of the universe. Modern anatomical humans, even though we've been around for 250,000 years, our evolution is connected from the very beginning of Gaia, billions of years ago. And so 4,000 years ago, a religion is invented. That does not mean the next day your blood changed. Now, people will say, well, I went on 23andMe or whatever, and, I'm 99% Ashkenazi. All that is a geographical marker that you came from Poland or Ukraine or Germany or what have you, right? That does not mean that your blood has changed because your ancestors had certain beliefs. And so part of our work to do is to really do the redemption work, really understand the decisions our ancestors made, honor them because they were products of their context and their consciousness at that time, and then to become contextually relevant beings and to shift those practices in a way that is true to this moment. And then the last thing to say is this is deeply related to death because we have this death phobic culture in the West where not only is the role of science the grand unifying theory of everything, but within that is this notion of progress as an arrow that gets ever better. And part of that is longer lives till we can upload our consciousness to the cloud and then we can become transhuman, AI beings that are, disembodied gods of some sort, right? This is the Silicon Valley, Elon Musk, Zuckerberg dream. And this is the logical outcome of a delusional set of beliefs that actually, as Carlos Castaneda said, live with death as your advisor. Being in deep contemplation, not only of our ancestral lineages and what they've done and, how they had to live probably, 1,000 generations of barely keeping body and soul together for us to be here. We too will die. And the aim is not to perpetuate our consciousness, but to see consciousness as a distributed phenomena. That consciousness does not just lay in the human brain, that it is, that we are embedded within consciousness itself. And this shift in ontology opens up all sorts of pathways of possibility. And so soma, ancestral pathways, and death are three important areas for contemplation to move us into these ontological shifts.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, it's listening to you, and I'll just bring it back to my own journey, my own work, the work we do with Becoming Crew. I mean, we've been running these kind of sessions where we've been exploring. We've been kind of trying to create the conditions to sort of open up to ancestry. We have, I've been working over the last years. I lost my father quite suddenly 2 years ago, and I was sort of had a few weeks with him as he was, was he going, was he staying, and had a really profound experience, sort of seeing him sort of leave this realm. And quite intentionally, I've been kind of, keeping him quite close to me since he passed. And what I've experienced in the last, year and a half is some really profound, to the point where I know he's showing up. He's showing up for me when I call on him at certain times, and he's coming to, I'm actually experiencing him through birds, which is kind of quite interesting. A particular bird called the goldfinch. I could go on about this because it's quite, but it is like, and I think what I find actually the possibility of what you're speaking to, and I know through my own felt experience and those in the communities of practice that we're working with, is that, actually, once you begin the practice, begin the work and open, show up, and it's not all fun and games. There's some difficult stuff to work with. But I guess what I'm saying is what I'm experiencing and those around me there's an expansion of possibility. There's an expansion of connection of like, who I am, why I'm here, like what is this world around me and that I'm part of. And so I'm really interested in, I guess, this, like how like what are the signs or signals you're experiencing? Because for me it is, like you said, it's a belief system. It's really a set of stories that we've been carrying about what is real. Where do I stop? Where do I begin? What is this thing called nature? Am I part of it? Not, they're effectively stories that have been informed by how we relate to this world around us and, ourselves. And so if we begin to relate differently, we begin to carry different stories. And so I'm really interested in, in how you are experiencing this work that you're carrying. And I guess maybe pulling it into, let's bring it into the capitalist dimension, right? We've got this mad thing that's just in like fifth gear trying to just keep going. And there are plenty of people who, at least I sense this, believe this is the only logic. This is the only way. And yet, you speak a lot to post-capitalism in the book and the principles, what does that mean, post-capitalist? What does it look like? But I even know from my own conversations with people, there'll be, a huge, probably the majority of people on this earth have been living post-capitalist realities, either for a long time or always, in some ways. And so there's a very small amount of the human population that is in this, capitalism is the only logic world, when you actually, at least that's how I perceive it to be. But of course it's so dominant. So I guess, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here, but I guess I'm just thinking, like, how are you, you put the book out, this is your work. how are you experiencing this invitation of this kind of level of letting go and trust that we're being invited into, to sort of, and vulnerability, I guess. And how are you experiencing this? Are these shifts happening in places that you feel need to be happening, or is it still very closed in certain spaces?
Sure.
Yes, that would be really good to give a post-capitalist sort of yes to folks.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start, and then Alnoor can chime in. So when we speak to post-capitalism, the first thing is what we've been talking about is a lot of it must be informed by capitalism itself. So we need to understand historical systems. We need to understand like these nested hierarchies that we've been embedded in. Alnoor said that we use, neoliberalism, late stage capitalism, capitalist modernity in some ways interchangeably. And we recognize this has been going on at some level. The project's been going on for 5,000, but we're particularly paying attention to the last 500 and especially the last 50 years of what's gotten us into the acceleration of the history of capitalism. So the first thing is, and it's well beyond the market and the exchange of monies. It is an understanding that capitalism mediates every part of our everyday life. From what food do we eat, to where do we live, to who are our friends, to whether or not we have access to this computer and a stable Wi-Fi connection and the ability to know one another. Every experience is mediated by capital. So that's the starting place for it. And the second piece, we speak of post-capitalism, not in a sense of what is old and new. So it's not to suggest that post-capitalism is a continuation in the notion of linear progress, that it is the next thing. It is not to suggest that we're invoking, when I said an old and new, there's a lot going on these days about the new culture and the new ways and all of that. We're using it more akin to the way that academics talked about postmodernism. It's informed by modernity. So we use it in that way to suggest that there is something that is outside of the linear notions of progress and the dimension of time that is post-capitalist as a way of being, as a set of values. So what are we invoking with some of those? I often will call them states of being, because I'm suggesting the praxis piece. And because values sometimes kind of feel out here, and there's a whole mimetic structure to that. But what we're suggesting is values such as solidarity, kinship, right relationship, nonviolence, leading with compassion, collaboration over competition, and others that we all kind of can feel and perceive. And when those values or those states of beings arise, we're referring to that as post-capitalism or post-capitalist realities. So it's kind of a container for this plurality of values that's more in accordance with life, or we might
very life-centered is
very life-centered, or right relationship with even the cycle of life and death in a way, since we've been invoking death here as well. And the last piece to say about it is what you referenced, which is to recognize we're here right now on the land with a dear sister, a Mayan woman from Guatemala, who said that in her lands and in her place, a couple of weeks ago, they were marking the 500 years since first contact with the conquistadores, and the way that there's kind of the life before and the life after. And many of us in the Western context are caught up in this motion, this funny I said motion, but this notion of we're in the apocalypse right now. And it's to suggest that there are many people in the global majority who have experienced the end of the world that they knew and have continued to live these other sets of values and ways of living. And in many ways, we honor and acknowledge and look to them of what is already and has been the living examples of post-capitalist realities. I don't know if Alnoor wants to add to that or before we move on to the other piece of the question.
Maybe just to say that, post-capitalism is not just like, it's not a temporal thing, right? And we've touched on this. It's not the thing that comes after capitalism. It's ways of living, being, and relating to the world that are based on values such as generosity, altruism, compassion, interbeing, animism, relationality, solidarity with all life, etc. And we can create these cultures, and that's part of our kind of generational task, is to create these embodied cultures. And we can do that with 3 people. Embodied cultures can be created with very small groups of people, and that ripples out. And you asked this question around practice, and part of that practice is to be good students of our culture, to really understand the impoverishment of the Western way of living. And I often say to white allies, like, we don't want or need, and it's not useful for white people to collapse into fragility, guilt, and shame. What we need is for white people to claim their ancestry and to declare, I am going to do the redemption work of my ancestors. And that means understanding the structural, historical antecedents that created this moment. If we spent a third of the time studying how the global operating system colonizes our mind, body, heart, soul, psyche complex, that we do reading self-help literature, we would already have a revolution on our hands, right? And then the natural next step of being good students of our culture is to become conscientious objectors of that dominant culture. Like, if we want what the dominant culture is selling on tap, if we want the Wikipedia page and the house on Fifth Avenue and all the trappings of capitalist modernity, we are already bought, right? The complex adaptive evolutionary system of capitalism finds the people that best serve its logic, and it pulls them to the top. There's no merit system. It's just who's the most willing to do the bidding of capital expansion through greed, short-termism, extraction, appropriation, those who covet status, wealth, power, etc. What the values psychologists would call extrinsic values, as opposed to intrinsic values, which is belonging, being in community, being in service, etc. And so to be a conscientious objector doesn't mean that you fully live outside the system, because we're all enmeshed in globalized neoliberalism. So we may live in an alternative community, but our clothes are most likely made in sweatshops. Our farm truck drives on fossil fuels. We need to get parts from a Toyota factory or what have you, right? It's being a conscientious objector is being so aware and informed by the dominant culture that we are repulsed by it, and we are actively trying to create and enact new, ancient, emerging types of relations. And then part of that is also going to counsel to the more the human world, right? Like we could, as activists, and I've attempted to do this, let's find all the acupuncture points of the neoliberal system and create movements of movements and all of that. And that's useful. And at the same time, perhaps, putting our head to the soil or asking a tree for advice and guidance is as good of a strategy as seizing a communications tower. Right? I don't know.
Funny, it's like one of my, I've been experimenting writing on LinkedIn this year. One of my most popular posts was I just posted about this oak tree that I go to for council, have done for years. And actually, I just asked a question, anyone else, got a tree that they go to for council? And actually, it was like, everyone's like, oh, I've got a tree. And it's like, I think it's right below the surface for a lot of people, It's just the ability, again, to speak to it and to make it, this is a sensible, lovely, beautiful thing to do. So, and it's almost like, you know what I mean? Once we start to, make these things visible and it's permission to play, it's permission to be weird. Because I think that's kind of, I use weird in all the best ways. I love, just weird is where I love to go. But, we have that in all of us, have got this kind of I think, inherent beautiful weirdness, but the system and the culture, the dominant culture, just hates it. It really, I watch it with my kids. I see them at school and I see how they change as they got into their early teens, and they're like terrified of showing their weirdness, because it's a monoculture. And so it's sort of,
and part of this practice is like we're building atrophied muscles, and these are practices that our ancestors knew inherently. And, in the, for example, like New Age spirituality, there's this notion that, you just have to take care of yourself and you have to do your own evolution and ideally ascension, and then you can, contribute. And what it does is we end up getting hijacked by this binary logic and just maintaining our status as good citizen subjects of capitalist modernity. When actually, there's this old Buddhist line that says, enlightenment doesn't happen in the cave, it happens in the mouth of the lion. By actively engaging with the ongoing destruction of the world, and availing ourselves to the living world by declaring what we stand for, then opportunities come where we can create citizens' assemblies and bioregionalism and localism and mutual aid networks and activism work. And all of these things start to appear when we say this, when we declare this is what we're interested in. And as soon as we're in this like self-focus of my evolution, my healing, my trauma, we collapse into the atomized self and just maintain our existing roles and archetypes within the system.
Do you think there's something sorry, Lynn, go on.
I was just going to add that, the different wisdom traditions would reflect on what Alnoor just said, is where ego wants to take false refuge, and that it's fierce and that we'll always find, but it's at the end of the day, it's an internal navel gazing. And this is what I see right now going on in a lot of the circles that are with the meta crisis, that are with this, is it's still very self-referential in a way, and it's caught in the victim perpetrator, or what do I do as a separate. And what Alnoor is pointing to again and again is this shift of ontology, this like ongoing practice of the way that we perceive. And then the other piece is the way that we relate to each other, to the more than human, to this present moment, rather than being present phobic and running off to the next like future scenario, or getting caught in nihilism or depression. And if that's there, that's what arises, but we're still in relatedness. And this is why we keep speaking to the ongoing practice, and we're invoking these values and ways of being that are every moment applicable for how we start to live new, ancient, emerging ways of being, other ways of knowing and being, that what we refer to as post-capitalist realities. And just the last piece to say is, you were asking, how is this work moving? And I just want to speak again to what I said, is that, we wrote this book. We didn't come out with like, let's do a strategy of a promotion, or let's try to get it out there, or make this, get people to read it. It was much more of, this is emerging. We're going to stay with relations. We don't know how this is going to move and how this is going to go, or where there might be curiosity, or where it may get traction. And we can point to what we have been perceiving changing over the past, or wouldn't even say changing, I might even say just emerging over the past, let's say, year. And yet it's almost like I can see it with peripheral vision, and I can feel it with tingles, and it's still coming into form. And for me, again and again, it's staying with the truth of relationship that is trying to find kinship, rather than an unconscious addiction to transactionality, a means to an end.
So, here's an invitation just to take a moment to breathe. Just to check in with your breath. Just to check in with your body. Just to pause. And to sit with what has been shared. Just noticing anything, feelings, sensations in your body. Just tuning in to your breath, your in-breath and your out-breath. Wow, beautiful. I was, yeah. I mean, I really get that with the. I see this. What you're is it's an offering. This work and you're you're working with that emergent quality. And I guess I was just curious. I mean, it's so much that's come up for me. Like, there's a few things just from what you both said. That what I'm noticing a lot is the need to be present, to be able to get into the body, for example, or to need to be able to sort of really sit with, to really notice the kind of the craziness of the system, or and that's both a challenge in this culture. At least, I'm speaking as a white man in the UK, in a highly westernized culture, who is walking the edges constantly of like what the system is doing and what's going on the ground. And what I sense is this. As soon as things get quite uncomfortable for people, which is quite quick, right? Particularly, you sit in silence with a group for not very long, things start coming. And of course, that's where, for me, at least mine, that's where, that's what you've got to tune into. And obviously going onto the land and working with this more than human kind of world, that requires, being on your own, that requires presence. It requires, so that I guess that practice, we come back to the need for community, the need for others to help with these, because I guess that's what I'm thinking about. I'm jumping to the capital. Like, for me, it's like, God, why, we need funds flowing into helping build these kind of really organic infrastructures that are built by people in places that can help, resource and sustain this, the systems that are going to be required to help people into these practice-driven cultures, I guess, because at the moment the machine doesn't really, like you say, to create the space, the spaciousness, and the time to sit with this, and then to kind of figure out how to respond to it, as well as of all the letting go, all the composting, all the hospicing of the madness that we've all been carrying. For me, it's both sort of beautiful, and at times I think, God, where's that going to shift? Because people are doing this work all over the place, right? And that's amazing. And I have to remind myself that this work's happening. It's happening all over, but this making it more intentional. And I guess the last thing, as you were speaking, Al, I again witnessed how deep the denial, I guess, is of this capitalist system that's, like you say, it's so pervasive, it's in us, it's programmed how we respond to things, how we think about our own entitlement and privilege, and all of this is stuff, but it's so deep that I think, particularly in the kind of Western culture, it's what I see is this, people they get the fear comes, and they haven't got the tools and the practices and the community to really step into it, and and to work with it. And the last thing that's come up is rites of passage. That's another thing I've been exploring a lot over the last couple of years, and just how missing obviously it is in the Western culture that I live in, and how, how, I guess paraphrasing here, but again, that relationship with the earth, a rite of passage, particularly like Vision Quest. I've been really, took part in the Vision Quest last year, and the guide I was working, he's an elder here, and again about the return, and that you're coming back to serve your community. You're not coming back to make yourself this better person in the machine. You're trying to find like what you're being called to serve, and that shift from child to adult, which is not. So I just see that, I look at the systems, look at these kind of the acceleration of that extreme kind of culture that we're in, and I see a lot of children in these positions of power, who are just kind of like, they're responding, it's just everything's reactionary.
So maybe just a little bit on like non-ordinary state, because we talked about some of the practices, right? Being a good student of the culture, becoming a conscientious objector. And then there's also accessing non-ordinary states. And you talked about this and touched on this. And there's many ways to do that, whether that's silence, rites of passage, ceremony, ritual, initiation, mantra, tantra, yantra, yoga, psychedelics. And I'm a McKennaite in the sense that I do believe that psychedelics are the fastest way to dissolve boundaries, to step outside the culture, to then understand what you're going to come back into and why. And at the same time, this is the complexity and the non-duality of the current moment, is that because we are so entrained, enmeshed, and conditioned within the neoliberal system, we basically use psychedelics as another way to evolve ourselves, right? What can I get from this medicine? And of course, it has to be done with, wisdom carriers, indigenous people, traditional healers, people who have grown up in cultures, worthy of the word culture. And it has to be done ceremonially. It has to be done with community. It has to be done with sacredness. But the point of all of these boundary dissolving, non-ordinary, non-dualistic states is to step back from the culture to then see how we can serve the deconstruction of systems of oppression and the co-creation of new cultures worthy of living.
There are two stories on Spaceship Earth, a passenger story and a crew story. The passenger story is based on extraction, transaction, and distraction, and it's leading us towards collapse. The crew story is based on connection, cooperation, and participation. It leads towards regeneration.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with my dad, Dan Burgess.
And I was going to add to that with what you were speaking to, is that Alnoor and I, in the book, and just as an offering, we have something that we call the 5-element mandala. And the 5-element mandala, we use that form because it's an inner journey, it's an outward journey, it's a recognition of the holographic fractal nature. And in that, what Alnoor just spoke to is kind of the center of what we speak about, this 5-element mandala. And it is for us an offering of coordinates of possible, of how do we start to walk what we call transition pathways? How do we do the work for the ontological shifts with an S, like an ever ongoing practice, that are walking away from systems of domination and extraction towards ones that are life affirming and honoring the cycles of life and death? So what he was speaking to is the center of that mandala, in a way, what we call the element of ether, and the recultivation and right relationship with life force. And so this is where we see a lot of the work on moving from a culture stuck in trauma and moving towards cultures of initiation. And there are myriad practices that help us continue to practice other ways of being and knowing, and actually move us back into a way of living in right relationship with life force. And then if I could just touch on, because it's the other pieces of what you spoke of what's in that mantra, I'll go from there. We go to the bottom, and that's the earth element. And there we talk about the creation and cultivation of post-capitalist infrastructure. And so again, some of this book, it has philanthropy on the title. It's a lot more than philanthropy, but we're looking at where the wealth, I often say, my dyslexia, I often say hoarders instead of holders, but it's both. And how do we get the wealth, the capital, to the liberate capital in service of life right now? And this is where we see the place-based work that works on developing and creating post-capitalist infrastructure, bioregional work, the work on the sovereignty of culture, education, health, protection of the waters. This is where we see a lot of the place-based work. And so there's a whole bunch of work in that earth element that we see in the material realm of form. The upper piece of that same axis is what we call the air element. And this is the work of how do we, as the cliche goes, get out of the notion of we can better see the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It points to a real dearth in the collective imaginary of how do we live, how do we have narratives of post-capitalist realities. And so this is the work you mentioned, the work of Culture Hack, and others, artists and educators who are really wayfinding how we have other narratives, and we start to create the memes, the narrative structures that are life-centric and life-affirming. And those things revolve around this element of ether or life force. And the other axis is what we also see right now, which is the work of solidarity with Indigenous peoples who are living in the biodiverse places, the most diverse places of the world. Less than 5% of the population that is stewarding more than 80% of where the world's biodiversity is and flourishing, that often have been living these post-capitalist realities. And it's a recognition that solidarity as someone who's in a white body is not something that I can assert. It is an ongoing practice of unlearning. It is a state that arises when I am in right relation and I am more in a relation of reciprocity, restoration, and there's movements going on around reparations are. And it's not about I'm doing the good thing and being a good white person. It's more understanding that my healing is bound up in the solidarity, and what do I have to let go and shed and I wouldn't even say sacrifice. I would actually say let go of my comfort and addiction. Yeah, for something to arise. And the other side of that is solidarity with social movements as well, especially in the world's majority. And here I'm thinking of the work that's happening in different places across West Africa and the Sahel that are actively in resistance to the legacy of colonial structures, that are actively trying to work on degrowth and the myriad movements that are happening. And again, it's not something I can assert or I can write a check to. It's something that I have to live and be in this ever ongoing practice, but it doesn't mean I don't be in action. It is a way of from the me to the we, and how do we be students of dominant culture so we find what that solidarity looks like and emerges in those states. Do you want to add anything to the?
Just maybe to come full circle back to money, let's use capital in the short period of time it's valuable to build this post-capitalist infrastructure. Like I know New Age people like to say money is energy, right? But it's so much more complex than that, right? Because Western Europeans and their descendants invented money and imposed it through colonialism and imperialism, and have a 500-year head start on capital. And so part of the redemption work is to use capital in the short period of time it's valuable. And that's related to death, right? Like when I say there's at most 20 years left of the Western way of living, that creates some form of collapse in certain bodies. And for other bodies, that is a sense of relief, right? And similar to the conversation on death, death is not some obstacle to bypass. It is the deity that gives life meaning. And the fact that we know there's an event horizon of this way of living can also be an opportunity and an initiation for us to create post-capitalist realities. And, as the quantum physicists say, we meet the universe halfway. There's no predestiny, and there's also no pure agency in the Western sense of the idea that we have full control and full containment of what's happening. We declare to the universe who we are, and then superpositions of possibility open up.
Beautiful. I think there's a lot of life in death, right? There is, death creates life, and there's a lot of aliveness that's there as well. And I'd like to just on that because if I can just for one little thing on funding and philanthropy and whatever, because I guess there's two things that are coming up for me. Obviously there's, which you speak to very deeply in the book about, just starting to recognize where money has come from, right? How this capital has accrued, all of the kind of beings and people and land and extraction and violence that has created these vast sums, and so in some ways it's like that are sitting there. And if we can acknowledge this ending, this financial system that is becoming, scientifically impossible to maintain for much longer. Because when I speak to funders about this, because I speak to funders quite a lot, they're like, oh, wow, that's just, it's very radical, that kind of thing, and I'm like, but hold on, if the science is, the Earth system can't support this model any longer, right? It's physics, it's not going to happen. So it's kind of like, but there's still this, and maybe it's the death thing you're speaking to. Maybe it's a fear and an inability to accept the ending of a whole part of this story. But I'm sort of curious as, you talk about the post-capitalist infrastructure, because that's where I'm there. That's the work that I'm seeing is so vital now. How do we build these wherever we are on Spaceship Earth? How do we start, this work? How do we start to weave these systems? And they're there and it's happening, but everyone's running on fumes as far as I can tell. It's like, it's so hard. And obviously we need, completely different types of ways of thinking about money. But I guess what would you say to, because I guess there's a hell of a lot of money that's locked up at the moment in philanthropy that's sitting there. But what's your message to kind of funders and philanthropists in these times? Like, here we are in 2024 with all of this carnage going on that we've spoken to. What would you say about, stepping into this? Like, what is it? What would you offer?
So I would first ask them to really reckon with the source of those monies and actually see the lands, the peoples, the living beings, the trees, the waters, the mechanisms by which that monies were made, and then the mechanisms by which that money continued to grow, and to the velocity by which that money continued to grow into the large amounts of, I would say, dams that it's like being held up in. And there's something about trying to connect with the source, the headwaters of those monies, and actually really take that in. I worked in a foundation for a while, and it was not at all something that people thought about. Like, what was the source of how these monies were made? Your government contracts that subsidize a business to grow, and the chips, and actually seeing those webs of relations. Sometimes it's too far for people to look at a table or a computer and to see it as a living being, but they can start to actually map and grok those webs of relations. The second thing earlier I stumbled on the word, whether or not I should say sacrifice, and what came after that was, if you're going to do that and you are in a body of someone who is an inheritor or a holder of large amounts of wealth or others, maybe you sacrifice the addiction to guilt and shame when you're actually reckoning with that. So you could be more in responsiveness. And then what we keep saying is that if you're really looking at what's happening with the growth of capitalism, that capitalism, it's what's driving climate change. It's what's driving so much of the meta crisis of where we are. And we don't know how much longer we have of the Western way of living, but we can all feel it, that we are at the precipice of whether it's another financial collapse in the next couple of years and the cascading crises and the acceleration of war, to sit with what happens over the next few years. Say you have a $10 billion endowment, or you're holding on to $500,000. And that is a lot of that quote unquote value is going to evaporate. So what is it that you could do right now today to put that money in service of life, to actually do the inner work, to not go and get caught in the guilt and the shame and another version of power and control, but I want to do the right thing with the money. These are not yours money. This is what you have been entrusted with and what you are stewarding, and it wants to move in service of life in this moment. And so use capital to liberate capital in this particular moment while it has value. And that you're in this moment of what Alnoor calls the redemption work. It's like at this end of this particular arc of where we are, what is the archetype? What is the way that you want to be living? What is the way that you see yourself being of service? Are you continuing the disease of hoarding, or are you actually going with current of the way that money wants to flow? And it wants to flow like waters to the lowest places. A dear ally, Todd James, says that anything of money that is not actually in flow is a continuation of the colonizing legacy. And so it's really putting a fine point on where are you right now and what's the game that you're playing, and being a deep honesty and reckoning with what that is and what the consequences of that is. And I would say for the rest of those who may not have the hundreds of millions or the billions, there's a deep question for us in the Western culture of what is enough? What can we let go of? How do we let go of our addiction to comfort, to certainty, to consuming as a way of navigating anxiety and dysregulation and disassociation? And how do we continue to practice solidarity? And what is our life force dedicated to in this way? How do we continue to live everyday post-capitalist realities?
Wow. Thank you, Lynn.
Even the idea of individual wealth, right, or the lone entrepreneur is part of the illusion and delusion of separation that is baked into capitalist modernity, right? The roads we drive on were paved by human labor. The schools we went to were built by other human beings and more than human beings. Even the flush of a toilet is, 500 years of engineering, cumulative, right? And so the world's wealth is our collective endowment, and we're not entitled to it. We are entrusted with it. And some of us are disproportionately entrusted with the stewardship of more funds than others. And given the context and the moment we're in, it's a very different role of what that capital wants to do and wants to be, and our relationship with it. And we see when foundations go unspent down, or people decide to give their money away, how deeply liberated they feel. Right? It's that the burden is not in giving it away. The burden is in accumulating and hoarding and holding it. And our higher self knows that's not our money, and it knows what that money could do if it went to the most marginalized peoples and built food sovereignty, water sovereignty, energy sovereignty, housing sovereignty at a local level. And then there's also the question of what archetypal role do you want to play at the end of time? To be a money hoarder at the end of history is a very particular karma to want to take upon yourself, right? And there will be a day the dollar dies. It's baked into the logic of the system. It is a self-terminating algorithm. There's no way around the math and the calculus thing. And then, it's also who do you want to be? Who will you be when there's no money and there's no guns? Who's going to fly their private jets and their submarines? Who's going to man their private islands and their bunkers? people who are growing their own food, and people who are living in a community, and people who are practicing indigenous ways of living and being, they're who's going to survive what's coming. And also, survival cannot be our motivation for doing what we're doing. It's I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else. Right? It's the kind of Albert Camus way of being, like when Albert Camus, who was treated very badly by the French because he was born in Algeria, and was treated very badly by the Jewish population of Paris. And he housed and hid 4 or 5 Jewish families during the Vichy France Nazi occupation. And, when journalists came to him after and wanted to tell the story of this famous writer who housed his Jewish neighbors, he was like, go write about something more important. I'm not a hero. I just couldn't imagine myself living any other way. That's the moral, ethical, ontological impulse. It's not to be righteous. It's not to be the savior. It's not to put, not to have our name on the wing of a hospital or a university, because that is the replication of the commodification, of the transactionalization, of the attribution that is baked into the capitalist colonialist mindset.
It's a couple of things. One, it's I'm just feeling my heart. It just feels like, this is heart intelligence, a lot of what we're speaking to, like, that if we're able to kind of really, tune in to the heart, and, when we're thinking about these kind of decisions we're being confronted with, which is really challenging, particularly if you've been brought up in a very heady, logic-driven culture, to trust. And it's also making me think of, so I guess one thing I saw is like where you have seen those shifts happen in people who have, who are looking after these kinds of large sums of capital. What do is there anything you can share about what's shifting them? What is the shift? And it's also just, I don't know, somehow I've got this story that's popped up. I think it was a First Nation, Native American a story. I can't remember what it was, but it was something like, when you come back home with, enough food for, several nights, what do you do to store it? And this idea, I store it in my neighbor's stomach. It's like, it's sort of making me think of, this kind of, these just really simple things that can be so, that can spread really fast and can be so transformational once they're there. But anyway, just some stuff that came up. But yeah, is there anything you could share about if you have witnessed these shifts? Like, what is it ultimately? Is it something that happens? Is it over time? Are you experiencing kind of like, or is it what we spoke about? It's these kind of more, transformational or moments where people really see their smallness in the whole thing.
As you just said, that piece about where I store my surpluses and my neighbor's belly, I was reflecting on, Alnoor and I are doing some work right now with Culture Hack Labs on, we worked with them to do a joint project on a narrative analysis and a hack on looking at philanthropy and what is actually holding it back. And what we're sitting with these days is what actually is not just a reconceptualization, and not just a reimagining, but really walking with what actually is wealth, and how do we not just imagine but live another way of being with wealth as a transition pathway, as a way that starts to walk us towards life-affirming systems. And so we're working with kind of starting to move other memes out there in the world that are much more ecologically based. And it's not just about a change of discourse. It's actually pointing to this change of ontology, the change of perceiving reality itself, the change of all of us recognizing what actually is wealth and what is material and what is poverty. And then how we can find our, I would perhaps say our toxic, often tabooed relationship with money to be with in these days. And so just a provocation that Alnoor may want to build on. And there's more work that will be coming out that's just, again, provocation with that.
Yeah.
And the piece then to say with those who are sitting within the hallowed halls of philanthropy, what we have seen is those who have been listening to the more than human, who've been sitting in this spiritual political praxis, who have really grappled with that this is the world's collective endowment. These are money's ill-gotten gains. It's not that they are justified in continuing to hoard or hold these monies, are starting to move. Whether that a foundation that has publicly said that they are not just on spend down, but that the whole enterprise of philanthropy is a continuation of the cycle of colonization, and they need to wholly redistribute what that is.
Like a Lankeli Chase move, that kind of move.
Yeah. And or another foundation that's much quieter about it, but is recognizing that what is it to actually hospice, and what do you have to shed? And sometimes it's shedding the county. Sometimes it's like shedding where the unconscious ways of control still show up, whether you're wanting to support the work, but you're still not sure whether you give the money, and then it's even releasing the governance structures themselves, who still feel a responsibility, not just to having legacy or a job, but a responsibility to the work that they have supported. And so there's a way in which I'm bearing witness to these entities, these organizations, these philanthropies in a death process with sites of resistance and site opening. And then there's others that are just in the readiness. There's a lot going on right now around the just transition. And what we're adding to that is that it's just transition and this ever ongoing shift of ontologies. So the manner by which we approach it, that the work that we're doing is continuing to affirm life in each way. So we don't just change discourse or set up some other structures that are going to continue to replicate extraction, inequities, and domination.
Yeah, and I know we're at time, Dan, and I'm sensitive of that, but also grateful for your graciousness and magnanimity. So maybe the last thing to say, a good way to close is also how we close the book, with the spiral of surrender control, traverse the threshold, re-enter the continuum of life and death. And that's what we often see when people are willing to let go of the control of doling out small amounts of money while keeping their corpus, their endowment in the extractive markets. Their sort of conflict dissipates, right? And with surrender comes the liberation. And then they have to traverse another threshold where it's like dealing with the board, dealing with internal structures, dealing with the identity. Well, who am I if I'm no longer, somebody who gives money to my local philharmonic and gets front row seats as a result, right? Or gets all the tax breaks that come with philanthropy. Bill Gates, for example, has received more in tax breaks than he's given since the beginning of the Gates Foundation, because that's how the system is structured. And so your identity has to shift, your benefits have to shift, your privileges have to shift. And there's also something that opens up within, because we're creating space. Like all forms of hoarding requires space, psychic space, emotional space, mimetic real estate. And then there's a kind of re-entering the continuum of life that is almost a form of initiation of kinds. And this doesn't happen once, it's an ongoing process. And so once people go through the cycle, the nature of the kind of cyclical quickening happens, right? And so the cycles happen faster, and they're more able to respond in a responsible, sober, accountable way, because they've done what is theoretically the hard part, which is surrendering control, power, wealth, the kind of extrinsic values that the culture holds up. And when they realize often that they've been held up in this false pedestal, right? When you have a lot of money, you often get surrounded by Byzantine courts of technocrats and bureaucrats and apparatchiks and media and other people that reaffirm your specialness for being, good at acquisition and extraction. And the new identities that can come through are so much more full than the identity of the entrepreneur or the CEO or the philanthropist, right? These are just shells of identity, but they're shells that get reified in a culture that's lost its way.
Wow, beautiful. Thank you both. It's just been. I mean, I could keep going, but it's like you got things to do. I wondered whether I could finish with just a couple of things we ask at the end of the episode. One is we explore in this podcast this idea of becoming crew, this idea that we're sort of part of, which I think is like this passenger story, which is the story of neoliberal capitalism. It's based on this kind of extraction, transaction, distraction. And we're trying to sort of like explore this story of becoming crew, which is ongoing. It's more about how we step into life and look at kind of connection and cooperation and participation, and maybe that will lead us to some kind of regeneration. But I guess we're that's the spirit what we're upholding here and exploring. So I just wondered, like, this idea of becoming crew, what does it bring up for you in this moment from where you're at?
These days, there's this language that I've been hearing for over the last couple of years, and I don't remember where I first heard it, whether it was in an alliance we were part of for a long time, Defend the Sacred Alliance or others, but I'm hearing it more and more, called islands of coherence. And when I first started to hear it, we actually talked about lifeboats of coherence. And so when you said crew, the first piece I was sitting with is like, what is that lifeboat of coherence? And not to be the survivors in this time, but in what Alnoor was speaking to, those that really have the fortitude and the courage and the humility to be with this moment of what can we let go of? What is the spirit of surrender? How do we cross this threshold of this initiatory moment that we're in? How do we not just do it as a separate self, but as a relational being? And what is that coherence that allows us to re-enter the continuum of life and death? And, Alnoor and I are not really on social media per se. So I'm not going to give an answer of like, here's how to sign up or how to follow us or anything like that. It's more what Alnoor was speaking to, which is, who are you in practice with? Who are you actually in an ever ongoing, perhaps bringing forth an island or a lifeboat or some way of coherence? Who's the crew? Not just by your preferences that is mediated by capital, but who do you feel like you have been assigned to, and by what place are you listening for what that assignment may be of what is yours to do in this liberatory impulse in accordance with living in life affirming systems? What are you walking off and what are you walking towards? This is what we're speaking to with these transition pathways. It's like the space between, it's like the cosmological rub of fermentation that something opens in that. That's that I first offer.
Thank you, Lynn.
I'd say, fortunately and unfortunately, we are crew, regardless if we are identified with us or not. We are entangled. And, none of us are free until all of us are free, as the abolitionist saying goes. And this Ilya Prigogine idea of islands of coherence is non-dualistically important, and simultaneously, there's going to be no islands within, the Gaian entelechy and the Terran whole. And, even our gut biomes are occupied by 90% so-called alien non-human bacteria. right? Our ancestors are living through us epigenetically and through the 93% of our DNA that scientists call junk DNA, right? There's electromagnetic resonance ancestrally. We're entangled with every human being, and more than human we interact with. It changes our neural pathways. Our ecology is determining the quality of our life. The food we put into our belly through the vagus nerve is determining the quality of our thoughts. And so really the question is, what archetypal roles do we want to play as crew members in the Gaian whole? And I often think of my uncle Diamond and his teachings on Sufism, where one of his first teachings is Allah, God, is a metaphor for the universe becoming self-aware through you. And it's not anthropocentric. Consciousness is also becoming self-aware through all life, whether we see that as animate or inanimate. And then, his second teaching is act accordingly. You are Allah becoming self-aware, act accordingly. And his third teaching is all the rest is commentary.
Thank you, Alnoor. Wow, thank you so much. I wondered if there's something you might leave our listeners. It could be an invitation to do something. It could be a practice. It might be something you want to just share. Anything. Hold on, that's my daughter calling me. I'll have to edit that out. I might leave that in. Yeah, just something in a spirit of participation, in a spirit of, becoming. Is there something you might leave our listeners to play with?
To this notion of crew, your daughter calling, the future generations, the kin calling. We're sitting here in Central America, and I've been invoking this notion of liberation. And I often reflect on what happened with liberation theology in the 60s. When was it that the priests said, we will no longer proselytize and just be of service to the theology of dominant culture, the church, but we will understand what is happening in a social and ecological condition. Sorry, there's someone. Okay. The social and ecological conditions of poverty in the world, and really reckoned with what is a theology that is liberatory in nature, and did a lot of organizing. And it was a time that the political and the spiritual was brought together, and it gave rise to many of the social movements that have endured, not just in Latin America, but there was a corresponding moment in many places of the world. There was, the liberation theology of Palestine, the Black liberation movement, like many parts of the world had this impulse. So as we've been invoking the notion of ontologies, a question that we sit with, and to your provocation with crew on the spaceship Earth, is what are the liberation ontologies for our times? And what is ours to do in relationship with that? What is the way that we practice the spiritual and the political in a way that is not just for my liberation, but is for the collective liberation? And what is it that we have to let go of, both in the way that we perceive and the way that we live, in our attachment to the phenomenological world and the way that we perceive it? But this is a provocation we might leave here, is really sitting with what is liberation and what are the requisite shifts of ontology and the ways of being that will allow life-affirming systems to arise.
Thank you, Liam.
Yeah, maybe circle back to two things you said. One was the funders coming back to you and saying, this is radical. And of course, they don't mean that in the true etymological sense of to the root. They mean it as a pejorative. And what I would say, if we're going to maintain the derogatory nature of radical, which is difficult for me to do, but I will do it for the sake of the thought, is the only radical or unbelievable thought is that we can continue on as we are. And then this other notion you said of, our book or our ideas, like we don't feel any attachment to these ideas. These are not ours in some possessive attributory sense. We have built on the work of decolonial thinkers, radical thinkers, indigenous thinkers and philosophers and cosmologists, mystics, and we're simply synthesizing. And if there's aspects of this conversation or the book or the work that resonates with you, great. Take that as your own and remix it and make that contextually relevant to your place, your geography, your community. And if it doesn't resonate with you, then you can ignore us. The request is, not to follow us on social media, but to not see us also as like separate aspects, but rather, in a gestalt sense, aspects of you reminding yourself of what you already know. And so we're not experts or specialist authors or anything like that. We're simply aspects of reminder. And, maybe to close, I will just close with the Arabic gratitude mantra, which is Shukran lillah wal hamdulillah, which is all praise is due to Allah, the Most High, and you are Allah becoming self-aware. Your consciousness coming online in a conscious whole.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alnoor. Thank you, Lynn. I love the weave of what you're saying here, and it reminded me of the way you spoke in your even in your about section in the authorship. You said something like, what was it? We ourselves do not know who we fully are. I love that. Don't read that often in a book, but I really connected with that sentiment. So let's leave it at that. But thank you so much for joining and for the time. And I wish you both well. What a time to be alive, eh?
Yeah, shukran for the time, and to the audience who listen. And I mean shukran not as thank you, but a nod to cosmic entanglement.
Beautiful.
So, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Alnoor and Lynn. There is a lot in those 2 hours. So, I'd like to finish this episode in a slightly different way, offering you a little invitation. Shortly, I'm going to read a little section at the closing pages of Alnoor and Lynn's book, and then play out with a song from a previous guest, Sam Lee. The song is called Green Mossy Banks, and it's from his new Song Dreaming album. And the invitation is either to walk, to go outside wherever you are and walk with this song, or if it's easier to lay down. Again, if you can do it outside, if you have access to some natural space, then maybe to lie down. But just to be with the song and with whatever is coming up for you after this conversation. As we embrace paradox and abandon the addiction of certainty, entitlement, and control, we may see that alternatives outside of the false binaries offered by capitalist modernity have always been with us. As we take seriously the fierce urgency of now, we may access a continuum of time that opens possibilities of radical restoration and transformation. The harbinger of post-capitalist realities may be as simple as laying one's forehead upon the naked earth in contemplation of the liberation of all beings. Thanks for listening. Till next time, peace and out.
When the land whispers, don't be a stranger, that irresistible call to come home. To the wandering swear an allegiance, renew an old contract to Rome. I felt in my heart a great yearning, leave a life so beholden to time. So I packed up my promise to face the uncertain, to attend to lost loves and landlines. Seven miles I will walk so uncertain, 7 miles I will walk in delight, 7 miles in consolable morning, 7 more unquestionably right. Some miles my heart will be empty, some miles I will rage and I'll cry, some miles I will crawl like a motherless baby, but the last mile I will take to the sky. Let journeys outshine destinations, intuition outdestine our fears. Let blisters be teachers, with blessings bestowed. Let the darkness restore us as seers. I'll make these pathways my companions, be witnessed by what cannot be seen. Be peregrine, be pasture, be tiny, be vaster, be as soft as green moss, and be free.
This podcast is created in service to life, for you. It takes time, funds and energy to make. If you'd like to contribute to the running costs, you can donate the price of a cuppa or a pint. Find the link on our website. This podcast wouldn't exist without the following crew: Charlie Shred, Audio Jedi; Seaman Home Burgess, Engine Room; Willow Burgess, Jingles;